Hello and welcome to our Making a Meaning series. This is session 4, Fallout and Downwinders, Visual Examinations of the Nuclear Age, presented by Margaret LeJeune. My name is Donald Hyatt. This program is presented from Rochester Public Library Arts Division. Thank you all for joining us today. Margaret is an image maker, educator, and an independent curator originally from Rochester, New York. She holds an MFA from Visual Studies Workshop. Her creative practice examines art, science, and place-based research. In 2023, Margaret was named the Woman Science Photographer of the Year by the Royal Photographic Society in the UK. She currently serves as the Barstow Artist-in-Residence at Central Michigan University and is a member of the board of directors for the Society for Photographic Education. And with that, I leave it to Margaret.
Thanks, Donald. Welcome, everyone. Glad to have you here today for Fallout and Downwinders. Since the inception of the atomic age, artists around the globe have generated visual responses to the development, use, and threat of nuclear weapons. In this session, we will examine works that consider the physical, psychological, environmental, and cultural effects of radiation, uranium mining, and disposal, as well as nuclear weapons themselves. It's been almost 80 years since the nuclear catastrophe caused by the US atomic bombing of the Japanese civilian populations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. Over the subsequent decades, reactions to these and other nuclear atrocities have spurred a wide range of resistance, protest, documentation, and artistic expressions. The works we will examine today show the sensitive and meaningful artistic commentary on the continued threat of nuclear war, the use of nuclear technology, nuclear accidents, and the impacts of nuclear testing. As the wars wage on in the Ukraine and Israel, we are reminded of the nuclear knife edge on which the world is precariously balanced. Hold 1 second, please. I'm having a little technical difficulty. Okay. The sudden awakening to the power of the atom, heralded by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, triggered a profound existential crisis. With the awesome power to destroy civilization now a reality, the human psyche was plunged into an introspection that was unlike any before. The result was a torrent of artistic and cultural expression that attempted to grapple with the enormity of the nuclear reality. On August 10th, 1945, a day after the Nagasaki bombings, Hamayata Yosoki began to photograph the devastation while working as a military photographer. Over a period of about 12 hours, he took around 100 exposures. By late afternoon, he had taken his final photograph near a first aid station north of the city. In a single day, he had completed the only extensive photographic record of the immediate aftermath of the atomic bombings of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Yamahata's photographs of Nagasaki remain the most complete record of the atomic bombing as seen immediately after. The New York Times has called his photographs some of the most powerful images ever made. Painter Salvador Dali thought he had seen it all, but the droppings of the bombs in Japan exceeded surrealism. He said, and I quote, "The atomic explosion of August 6, 1945 shook me seismically. Henceforth, the atom was my favorite food for thought. Many of the landscapes painted in this period expressed the great fear and inspired in me by the announcement of that explosion," unquote. In fact, Dali may be the first artist to have exhibited a nuclear artwork. In December of 1945, he displayed the painting Uranium and Atomica Melancholia Idol, a response to Hiroshima, featuring molten, decaying objects, a mourning, floating face, and an uncomfortable juxtaposition of two American images, a baseball player and a bomber. "The bomb," said Dali, "burns the mind and scars the imagination." In this work, Dali uses his characteristic figurative style inhabited by soft shapes, represented with a black image whose hollow illuminates another reality outside of which is identified by the airplane that we see on the face, the explosion of the bombs, Beginning in the late 1940s, Dali's work moves into a new sort of mystical nuclear phase in which he makes a number of works that depict the disintegration of the atom in paintings with religious subject matter. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy had immigrated from Europe to the United States to run the new Bauhaus in Chicago. In these two works that we see here, he combines the ideas of art and technology, condensing harsh imagery of nuclear destruction, nuclear warheads and billowing smoke into a shiny sphere of pleasing colors. While this combination may mystify viewers, further insight into this work can be gleaned from notes about Nuclear One for the They Seek a City exhibition held at the Art Institute in Chicago in 2013. The catalog says, and I quote, Moholy-Nagy's explored the threat of the atomic warfare in Nuclear One CH, which he painted in response to the bombs that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan in fall of 1945. Nuclear One CH enigmatically depicts a glass sphere, or nuclear bubble, as Moholy-Nagy's wife described it, hovering over a rectangular grid. Reminiscent of a cartographic map of city blocks that evoke the Chicago skyline, as it would have been seen as an aerial view looking south, this grid specifically situates the painting in the city. In the weeks after the bombing in Japan, local newspapers employed such aerial cartographic imagery of Chicago to explain the power of the atomic bomb. These illustrations suggest that Moholy-Nagy might have picked up on this compelling visual theme, which he coupled in the painting with the nuclear bubble to signify the force of the explosion. The first big group show in 1950 in Paris was dominated by this single painting. Bernard Loger, huge 12-foot by 8 feet atomic age, made everything else at the salon either timid or old-fashioned. By its size, its very dull coloring, and its anti-war theme, the picture was clearly intended to invite comparison with Picasso's famous canvas of the Spanish Civil War, Guernica. Though not a fan of his elder, Loger had followed Picasso's symbolism while challenging him in his treatment. Like Guernica, Loger's atomic age features a horse and a bull, while Picasso's horse rides, wounded. Loger's flies above the scene, whipped up by a skeleton. And while Picasso's bull stands threatened, Loger's is decapitated. The head sleeps on a striped pedestal, a plucked rooster between its horns. Both Picasso and I went to the same source, he said, to Spain. Presumably, he was shouting about the world that had been threatened by the atomic bomb. He meant this painting, though, to convey a sense of hope. If there's another atomic war, he said, the aftermath will be that there is going to be the need to nourish humans if they are still alive. So for nourishment, he paints a picture where has a big table that's full of things like fish and fruit, ham, chicken, there's even lobster there on the table, a skinned hare. The rest of the painting seems to show all kinds of things that you would need to have in the world if you wanted the world to feel complete, even after an atomic bomb. So you have a broad model, a shepherd boy with a goat, a man with a wheelbarrow, a bishop, a gargoyle, a rat, a frog, a monkey, a barking dog, a girl with a bouquet of flowers. But many of the people who saw this painting were rather unmoved in the gallery when they saw it. One said, and I quote, "One atomic bomb and all that will be left is the chicken, or perhaps only the rat." This work is titled Fire, and it's the second panel of a 15-work series titled Hiroshima Panels. It was created in 1950 by the husband and wife team, Iri, who was a Chinese ink painter, and Toshi, who was an oil painter, their last name Maroki, after they witnessed the aftermath of the atomic blast at Hiroshima. They were not there on August 6th of 1945 when the bomb Little Boy, enriched uranium bomb, was exploded by the US Air Force about 600 meters above the city. It killed approximately 66,000 people and injured a similar number. some of whom were American prisoners of war and allies who had the misfortune of being there. 3 days later, the more complex and destructive Fat Man nuclear weapon was exploded over Nagasaki, and that killed approximately 39,000 and injured approximately 25,000. When this artist couple arrived to Hiroshima to find out whether or not their relatives had survived, they began to create a series of ink and watercolor and chalk images in the traditional form of a wall screen, a wind wall screen that is folded and sort of hinged. And they were doing this based on the testimonials of the survivors that they were talking to. And this is a very large scale composition. It's about 3.5 feet tall and over 25 feet long. They would lay the paper on the floor, and what they were trying to depict was a collage of what the survivors had experienced. So Toshi, who was really good at figure drawing, would first use ink and chalk to draw out the figures, and she used loads of red. And then she handed over to Erie, who worked monochromatically, and he would sort of splash dull ink all over the bodies to sort of soften them, break them up, and blend them into the landscape, which, as you can imagine, was similar to what people were experiencing during this destruction. This confusion of the outline of the figures, the couple felt, was a way to convey the confusion that people on the ground were experiencing and the absolute chaos of war. And it seems ultimately that the figures seem to disappear in and out of the imagery, right? In and out of the paper, very much like how our memories might react to something of this sort of traumatic and chaotic experience. This is a close-up of the image, so you can really get to see the flames and the body parts. You can see children. You can see burned figures, screaming, right? Just absolute chaos within these scenes. And we actually have some quotes from the artist about making this. And so here I'm going to read you a quote. "These are the pika, a strong blue-white flash, the explosion, the pressure, the firestorm. Never on earth or in heaven has humankind experienced such a blast. Flames burst out in the next instant and leapt skyward, breaking the stillness over the boundless ruins. The fire roared. Some lay unconscious, pinned by fallen beams. Others, regaining their senses, tried to free themselves, only to be enveloped by the crimson blaze. Glass shards pierced bellies. Arms were twisted, legs buckled. People fell and were burned alive. Hugging her child, a woman fought to free herself from beneath a fallen post. Hurry, hurry, someone shouted. It's too late. Then hand us the child. No, you run. I will die with my child. She would only be left to wander the streets. The woman pushed away the helping hands and was consumed by flame." Moving on to this image by Henry Moore. This is a bronze sort of plume. It was created between 1964 and 1966, and it stands about a mile west of Lake Michigan. And it really seems to look like atomic vapor frozen solid in the shore wind. It occupies a bare plaza in the middle of the University of Chicago, surrounded by residence halls and faculty buildings. And I use the word occupy very intentionally. Moore's monument has a sort of implosive density that the camera rarely can capture. It seems somehow smaller than its 12 feet thick and very potent feel. The effect is as much psychological as it is physical. The sculpture seems to radiate into the civic space. 1 feet of metal commemorates another. Moore's sculpture marks the place where the nuclear age dawned, the site of the converted squash court, where a 25-foot stack of uranium and graphite, Enrico Fermi's team successfully engineered the first self-sustaining chain reaction on November 1942. Fermi's reactor was integral to the Manhattan Project, its success a crucial step in the production of plutonium for the first nuclear weapons. Without the chain reactions, no Hiroshima. Without the political desire for an atomic bomb, no nuclear energy. We can see this as part totem, part cloud, part skull. The work seems to embody the history of code development. At the top, the bulbous explosive head. Below, the dome shelters a cavern scarred like bare rock. Imagine the sculpture inverted, falling from the belly of a long-range bomber. Now, instead of a dome, you have a warhead. Moore's initial, more ambiguous title was Atom Piece, Piece. It was changed in order to emphasize the positive application of nuclear technology, and according to some accounts, because of the unintended pun on the word peace, Peace. But why not embrace the plenitude of these meanings, right? Isn't that what art is all about? More sculpture bears it, built as it is out of the conviction that the destruction and the creative potentials of atomic science are unthinkable in isolation. Throughout the 1950s, governments on either side of the Atlantic invested heavily in both aspects of nuclear technology, civilian as well as military, setting in motion sophisticated public relations exercises in order to sell the atomic age to the masses. To many, the specter of nuclear weaponry seemed to impoverish the visual imagination, to obliterate meaning. The visible agency of radiation marked, I should say, the invisible agency of radiation marked a challenge to the power of the image. Some of the most powerful art that came out of this period, I think, was made by artists who were not quite so clear where they stood in regard to nuclear technology. Andy Warhol's atomic bomb is not a protest so much as it is a description, right? It is the constant repetition of the same terrible sight that Warhol comments on. Atomic bomb has blasted pathology of a mind bombarded by images of apocalypse. Pictures so widely diffused, they have become routine for us to see. He silkscreened a photograph of a mushroom cloud in black, surrounded by a deep red dull. Red and black are the only colors left. The only sight is the cloud, repeated, multiplied, as if hundreds of missiles are striking. At the bottom of the painting, everything turns to black. It is a vision of the moment when the bomb falls, a recognition of what is promised in every photograph of a mushroom cloud. And who will watch the final display of mushroom clouds? Well, who will be left to see it? Another work by Andy Warhol, this one is called Bomb. This is quite a striking sculpture. Unites the most potent elements of his practice into kind of a singular image. The silver finish and cultural symbolism of the object are quintessential sort of marks of Warhol's works, qualities that testify to the complexity of Warhol's artistic project that as once appropriated the tools of popular culture and delivered an incisive critique of society that was becoming captive to the sort of mass distribution of images of the atomic bomb. So what he did here is he repurposed a discarded dummy bomb that was used for training exercises. The object itself is a unique military article in everything, but it has no payload. It is this like collusion of the authentic and the superficial that is the cornerstone of Warhol's practice in the 1960s and what makes this work so thought-provoking. By 1967, when this was made, the Vietnam War had entered its most heightened and bloody phase. With the mass protests of war, the counterculture and anti-war sentiment was being highly stirred in the late 1960s. The image of the bomb is a contentious one, and that would not have been lost on Warhol. The silver finish of the sculpture reflects the silver finish of Warhol's factory, with the bomb serving as a relic and vestige of that storied studio space. The silver-filled factory, along with the silver bomb and silver Coca-Cola bottles, also created around the same time frame, cement silver as the new identity of Warhol's brand, replacing the Campbell soup cans and other branding that Warhol had appropriated as his own. In a work contemporary to Moore's sculpture that we looked at, Nuclear Energy, the astonishing Beach Girl nuclear victim here from 1966 by Colin Self sort of eschews ambivalence in favor of a more direct assault on our senses. The first thing you might notice about Self's harrowing sculpture is this confection of cinders, paint, and a shop window mannequin. What you might notice is that textural contrast between the bloated granular cast in which most of the anatomy is sheathed and the smooth sheen of the body, some of the parts that seem to escape the disfigurement, the well-shaped nose and cheeks, the curve of the exposed breast. The total impression is overwhelming of decay and morbidity, erosion, a braided surface that resembles maybe a bronze or a marble statue that has been long submerged underwater. What Self's atomic sculpture shares with Henry Moore's, despite the obvious difference in style, is an emphasis on texture and touch, on surface variations that demand a tactile rather than merely optical way of seeing. At the same time, both sculptures repel the imagined tactility, nuclear energy by Moore by its sheer monumental mass, but Beach Girl Nuclear Victim by its uncanny, hyper-realistic ugliness. The desire for physical contact comes to be felt somehow menacing, dangerous even, as these objects themselves have been rendered radioactive, emanating an invisible, lethal energy. Their power comes not first off from what they represent, whether it's abstraction or sort of this hyper-realism, but from the way that each artist and the viewer sort of has a physical response to the dimly understood phenomenon of radiation. The 3 Mile Island accident was a nuclear meltdown of the Unit 2 reactor of the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station on the Susquehanna River in Londonderry Township near the capital city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The reactor accident began at 4:00 a.m. on March 28, 1979, and released radioactive gases and radioactive iodine into the environment. It is the worst accident in U.S. commercial nuclear power plant history. On the 7-point International Nuclear Event Scale, the TMI, or 3 Mile Island, if you will, accident is rated a level 5. It's an accident with wider consequences, quote unquote, wider consequences. At one point during the crisis, experts were uncertain if there would be a total meltdown or possibly a giant explosion. As a precaution, the governor at the time advised pregnant women and preschool-age children to leave the area within 5-mile radius of the 3 Mile Island facility until further notice. Well, as you can imagine, that led to panic that the governor had hoped to avoid. And within days, more than 100,000 people had fled the surrounding towns. The incident has greatly eroded the public's faith in nuclear power. And the artist that I'm showing you here, Robert Del Trideschi, he first began making work about nuclear issues in response to the 3 Mile Island accident. He went on to document the US H-bomb factories in his book, At Work in the Fields of the Bomb. He became a principal photographer and designer for 3 government reports on the past, present, and future of radioactive cleanup in the United States. And in 1987, he founded the Atomic Photographers Guild, an international collection of independent photographers dedicated to making visible all facets of the nuclear age. And I'm going to talk about another one of those photographers a little bit later. These 2 works are by American artist Suzanne Hodes, and she was the wife of Henry Lynchitz. He was one of the main scientists behind the design and assembly of the nuclear bomb. She was quite distraught with the vast destruction of the bombs. Both her and her husband were, and they became ardent anti-nuclear activists after the war. And they founded a couple of different groups. One was called the Artists for Survival, and another was called the United Campuses Against Nuclear War. And Hodes' activism is illustrated in these 2 artworks that we see here. The painting on the left-hand side is called Hiroshima Mother, and it depicts a mountain of flesh and bone, recalling the really visceral images of melting and mangled corpses that emerged from Japan after the war. She depicts a woman and an infant in agony, caught between radioactive decomposition and the last breaths of life atop a pile of bodies. The child presented here acts not as just a symbol of the mother's personal loss, but the losses of a whole generation, as many people suffered with poisoning from the radiation. The work on the right-hand side is called 3 Minutes to Midnight, and it's a lithograph. And here, Hodis replaces the biblical apple of knowledge with the doomsday clock between the two figures, the visual countdown to a man-made global catastrophe. In the painting, there are only 3 minutes left to midnight, the moment when the world as we know it will end. The work, made in 1984, reflects the deepening nuclear tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, which had many in fear that the end of the world was near. The Chernobyl disaster began on the 26th of April in 1986 with the explosion of the number 4 reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was located in what is now northern Ukraine, close to the Belarusian border. It is one of only 2 nuclear energy accidents rated at a 7, the maximum severity on that international nuclear event scale I mentioned previously. The other one being the 2011 Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan. The initial emergency response and subsequent mitigation efforts involved over 500,000 people and cost an estimated $68 billion. It is considered the worst nuclear disaster in history. And although it's difficult to compare releases between the Chernobyl accident and a deliberate airburst of nuclear detonation, it has been estimated that about 400 times more radioactive material was released from Chernobyl than by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki together. At Chernobyl, approximately 39,000 square miles of land was significantly contaminated with fallout, with the worst hit areas being Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. But lower levels of contamination were detected all over Europe. And the work we're looking at here, entitled Chernobyl, was designed by a Belarusian artist named Alexander Kishchenko, which commemorated the Chernobyl tragedy. This is a hand-woven tapestry, and it was gifted in commemoration of the United Nations international cooperation for a solution to the disaster. So Belarus gave the tapestry to the UN in 1991 after the Soviet Union asked the world for more support to get through the nuclear and radiation disaster. The newly independent Belarus gave the tapestry not long after the US passed a General Assembly resolution calling for an international cooperation to address the issue. But what happened in the following months is what is most interesting and really tells a different story. Not long after the donation, the UN members canceled a pledge for $648 million in aid to the most damaged countries because scientific data showed erroneously little effects of nuclear explosion. The Chernobyl tapestry, although given with good intent by Belarus, embodies the slow and dangerous reaction in the region and the rest of the world to what remains one of the planet's most disastrous and controversial nuclear tragedies in history. Halfway around the world, this Melbourne artist, Lynn Onis, is known primarily for his paintings, but we're going to discuss this really fascinating 3-dimensional artwork here. The inspiration for this sculpture, which is titled Maralinga, grew directly from his exposure to the central Australian landscape. As the Australian desert site for atomic bomb tests conducted by England in early 1950s, Maralinga has become an enduring symbol for both the desecration and the pollution of the landscape. It is also a potent commentary on the compulsory displacement of its Aboriginal landholders from their traditional land. In the realistic treatment of the mother and child sheltering each other from the bomb's lethal wind blast, the composition carries an additional message as a potent evocation of human desolation caused by wars and instruments of war. The mushroom cloud, which we can't really see because it's facing directly perpendicular to us, is shown as a sort of, and its radioactive symbols that we can see. These are sort of pointers to the specific events that happened at Maralinga. In the early 1990s, a public petition requested that the sculpture Abakanosa create a permanent work in Hiroshima, Japan, as a memorial to the victims of nuclear destruction. What she had proposed is the image that you see here on the left, a hand-like tower that's poised as if it's going to be able to catch the bomb in the exact place that it exploded over the city, which was about 600 meters above sea level. This project was never carried out due to worries that it might offend the sensibilities of the survivors. There was worries that it might be perceived as too aggressive. So in response, she instead created the image that you see on the right-hand side, which is an installation called Space of Becalmed Beings. And this was created in 1993. And it's a monument of 40 silent, seated bronze backs. The forms are a permanent installation on the terrace of the Contemporary Art Museum in Hiroshima, and it overlooks the city where it is said that people were seeking shelter in the aftermath of the atomic bomb and that many people had actually died on this area. The sound of air through the figures when you're standing in this space is incredibly creepy, and it sort of reverberates like the sound of cries. Well, most of the artists that we've looked at so far have made work in response as civilians to the deployment of nuclear weapons and disasters. James L. Accord took a very different approach. He was an American artist who worked directly with radioactive materials. He attempted to create sculptures and events that probed the history of nuclear engineering and asked questions about the long-term storage of nuclear waste. For 15 years, he lived in Richland, Washington, at the dormitory town of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, at one time home to 9 nuclear reactors and 5 plutonium processing complexes, and the most contained nuclear sites in the United States. His major ambition while he was there was to create a nuclear Stonehenge on a heavily contaminated area of land within the site. Accord was the only private individual in the world licensed to own and handle radioactive materials. And he acquired nuclear fuel rods containing depleted uranium as part of his artistic practice. He actually had a nuclear license number, as I mentioned, being the only, civilian to have access to this materials, and he proudly tattooed that on his neck. Accord, however, found it very difficult to make nuclear art either commercially viable or even illegal. We're going to pivot a little bit now. This is the photographer Yushi Miyoko, and she uses everyday women's objects to memorialize the Japanese victims of the US bombing in Hiroshima. She photographs the victims' possessions, especially clothing, although sometimes we see purses and shoes and other artifacts. They are frayed with age and radiation. Some of them are still, you can still see blood speckles on them. And she makes her work as a response to the enormity of the nuclear war by focusing on the sort of daily textures of women's lives. The photographs really restore the idea of individuality, right, and the dignity of the people who may have literally disappeared in the blasts. Her work demonstrates that the aftermath of nuclear trauma is interminable as the radiation from the blasts itself. It devastates whole physical and cultural ecosystems. It doesn't end, at least not on a human timescale. This work here is really interesting. It's called Cardigan Worn by One Woman of the Boeing 5, tried for entering the Boeing nuclear missile plant on September 27th, 1983, sentenced to 15 days in the King County Jail for defending life on Earth in 2011. Ellen Lesperance was an artist who was really interested in animating archives and feminist histories. And what she did is she recreated sweaters worn by individuals at protests during the 1980s and 1990s. And so this is a replica sweater of one of the women who were at this Boeing cruise missile plant outside of Seattle in 1983. And she was trying to urge the workers to cease production of military weapons. The cardigan and the sort of painted knitted pattern, which invokes the traditional category we call women's work sometimes in art history, memorializes this act of civil disobedience and position of feminist and anti-war causes as ones that can be readily taken up by current and future generations. The Fukushima nuclear accident was a major nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Fukushima, Japan, and it began on March 11th in 2011. The cause of the accident was from an earthquake and a tsunami, which resulted in an electrical grid failure and damaged nearly all of the power plant's backup energy sources. The subsequent inability to sufficiently cool reactors after shutdown compromised containment and resulted in the release of radioactive contaminants into the surrounding environment. In the aftermath of the Fukushima disaster, the most severe nuclear accident since Chernobyl, the psychological, the physiological, and the ecological effects of nuclear power again proved compelling to artists who sought to imbue their work with the authenticity of irradiated matter. Hilda Hellström's work, The Materiality of Natural Disasters that we're looking at here, consists of a set of rough dishes molded from soil collected in rice fields surrounding the sealed off power plant. Because the radioactive component of the soil, the resulting vessels are rendered unsuitable for functions suggested by their form, right? Radioactive toxicity becomes the measure of their aesthetic purity. The 5 pots and plates are lumpy and misshapen, as you can see here, and they look like they might crumble at any moment. They look unfit, and they are. The vessels are irradiated, but within allowable levels, quote unquote. Hellström dug up the soil with Nayatu Madasomri, a former rice farmer and the last living resident inside the exclusion zone. The other component of this piece is a 12-minute long video in which Hellström made of her and this farmer documenting his life inside of the exclusion zone. He lives there alone, without water or electricity, on his land that will not be farmable for at least another 30 years. But he has said he is unwilling to leave because who will feed the animals? The Fukushima exclusion zone has itself become the unlikely site of an exhibition organized by Japanese art collective Chin Pom, Don't Follow the Wind. Details of the artworks themselves are appropriately difficult to come by, though among them is Trevor Paglen's Trinity Cube, which we're looking at here. It's a block of irradiated glass from Fukushima combined with a core of tritite, which is the eerie man-made mineral produced from fused sand at the site of the first nuclear weapons tests. So this piece is installed within the abandonment zone. These works and others in this exhibition will remain off limits until falling levels of radioactivity make it rendered safe for humans to return. These works remind us that in world historical terms, we live at the beginning of the nuclear age that already stretches tens of thousands of years into the future, a timescale well beyond the recorded experiences of our species. Drowned undersea or buried deep beneath the earth, the waste products of our nuclear projects will still be toxic when our descendants, if we have any, bear no more resemblance to us than the Paleolithic sculptor who made the Woman of Willendorf. What will they think we wanted, and what will they think we feared when they find these things? I'm going to finish out today speaking about several projects from 2 artists. I decided to focus on these at the end because I think both of these artists are making really important contemporary works about nuclear power, energy, and weapons. The first is Abby Heppner, and she is a photographic artist who works at the intersection of art and science, investigating biopolitics and the use of health as currency. Heppner is originally from Utah, where her ancestors were Downwinders, who suffered in the aftermath of the United States nuclear testing. Her work on nuclear issues began shortly after the Fukushima disaster in 2011, when she traveled across Germany documenting decommissioned nuclear power plants. Shortly thereafter, she lived and she volunteered in Japan. And she is one of the members of the Atomic Photographers Guild that I mentioned earlier. The Guild members focus on the impact of legacy of the atomic age, with an emphasis on nuclear weapon development, production, testing, and deployment, as well as the movement to abolish them. Members also document the nuclear power industry, reactor accidents, nuclear waste, irradiated landscapes and their pollutants, and the health effects associated with exposure to radiation. The work we are looking at here is from Heppner's series, Palinopesia, and she states about this work, quote, "The dropping of the first atomic bomb was the largest photographic event ever to occur. Inscribed by catastrophic light, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became cameras. Atomic shadows, traces appeared throughout the city. Body-shaped black marks where people stood at the time of the detonation. The violent light bleached the buildings and sidewalks, except where a body had interrupted it. The shadows were photograms. Atomic veterans who watched the tests in Nevada deserts recalled the turning away from the bomb's blinding light and covered their eyes with their arms. The flash, an X-ray, rendered their bodies momentarily transparent. They saw through their eyelids and the bones in their arms became visible. Hebner created this project by photographing a computer screen displaying Google Earth satellite images of bomb craters at the Nevada test site. The film captures an inverse of the image, filling the absent cavity with visible light. It creates an illusion of matter where the matter was removed, reflecting radiation's introduction into the atmosphere. Hebner's appropriation of these images is an act of counter-surveillance and provides commentary on image consumption and the inaccessibility of place and its history. Here are a couple more from this series. In another series by Hebner titled Uravan, she depicts the town of Uravan, Colorado, which can still be located on a map. However, it isn't easy to find because it's buried under layers of clay, soil, and rock. Standard Chemical Company established the town of approximately 1,000 residents in 1912, naming it after the two minerals mined in the area. Activities at the local processing mill contaminated the soil and groundwater with radioactive chemicals, so much so that in 1986, the Environmental Protection Agency closed the town and relocated the residents. Uravan was shredded, burned, and buried by the EPA, creating a 680-acre Superfund site. For this series, Hebner created three-dimensional laser-engraved pigment prints by photographing the exact locations of those historic images of buildings that existed before the town was destroyed. Formed by laser burning into layers of paper at various depths, the historic structures appear against bleak and empty contemporary landscapes. Here are a few more of these images. In her series Monument Plinth, Hebner features aerial images from 40 uranium disposal cells across the US. Uranium disposal cells are geometric mounds engineered to isolate radioactive material from the surrounding environment. The mounds sit above the ground and covered surfaces from a few acres to a few miles and consists of an outer shell of riprap rock and a clay soil layer that covers the radioactive material. They are designed to allow for rain runoff and to prevent plant growth from forming on top and penetrating the clay layer. Some sites that produce the waste contained in the cells date back from the Manhattan Project, and they were created to mine and construct nuclear weapons. Some of the sites continue to operate today for nuclear energy industry. The amount of radioactivity in the cells varies, but most radiation comes from uranium-238, with a half-life as old as the Earth, or 4.47 billion years. There are over 100 sites like these that exist in the US, and the number is growing. And as an aside, one of the things that we are grappling with is how do we let people in the distant future know what they will find at these sites? What kind of text, what kind of images, what kind of placards do we put there so that people know that this is a site that is unsafe to dig or live around? What Hebner did is she printed and mounted each image of aerial views of these places on black acrylic and laser engraved the cell detail into the surface, reflecting an internal space or void. So here you see Weldon Springs, Missouri, and on the left half of the screen, you can sort of see the black areas that she has etched in with laser etching, and you can see just how close this is to a very populated town. Here again in Arizona, and here in Crosby Township, Ohio. In her series Control Room, Hepner photographs Plant Vogel in Waynesboro, Georgia, a site affiliated with the so-called nuclear renaissance. Commercial nuclear energy reactors are being built for the first time in the US since 1979 partial meltdown of the 3 Mile Island. Like the boom towns that emerged from rapid industrial expansion, Waynesboro's population increase will be short-lived. Workers come from across the country for temporary jobs such as welding and running power lines from the new cooling towers. While some residents embrace the plant, others have fought against it since the first 2 reactors were built in the 1980s, and they witnessed health and economic decline in the area. Most recently, a community of activists has risen up. Health, as they see it, is a currency that is being exchanged for these temporary jobs. Waynesboro is likely to be the first of many cities grappling with these issues as the nuclear renaissance continues to spread across the Southeast and nuclear energy is revitalized as a solution to climate change battles. And I'm going to wrap up this talk by speaking about the work of Kei Ito. Kei is a Japanese-born East Coast-based visual artist. He earned his MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Art, and he currently teaches at the International Center of Photography in New York City. I happen to have the great pleasure of being at an artist residency with Kei at the Santa Fe Art Institute last year. And I got to witness his process in person, and it was really incredible to speak with him. Through the experimental process of cameraless photography and installation art, Ito negotiates intergenerational connection and loss, using his own ancestry as a case study for contemporary and future events. Ito's work is formed by his own nuclear heritage as a 3rd-generation atomic bomb victim, a legacy of trauma inherited from his late grandfather, who survived the United States bombing of Hiroshima, Japan in 1945. The work we're looking at here is called Each Tolling Sun, and it's such a poignant and thought-provoking installation. At the heart of the work lies a compelling centerpiece, and you can see it on the floor on that pedestal. It's a circular metal sheet distorted by Ito's deliberate strikes with a sledgehammer, totaling 108 blows. Surrounding this centerpiece are 108 vivid photogram images, each capturing a progression of orange, yellow, and red circles against stark black or red backgrounds. These circles, akin to the transformed metal, embody a symbolic journey through 108 iterations, culminating in a powerful visual narrative. His grandfather's legacy as an anti-nuclear activist profoundly influences Ito's artistic expression, echoing a fervent plea for peace amid the haunting memories of past devastation. For Ito, the sun emerges as a profound symbol, signifying both life and destruction. This dichotomy forms the crux of his artistic exploration, encapsulating the overwhelming power and inevitable consequences associated with nuclear weaponry. Ito's frustration with contemporary nuclear tensions is palpable in his direct strikes on that metal plate, symbolizing a call for global harmony and disarmament. The series of circles exhibited in the gallery space distills his frustrations into representations of 108 suns. 108 is a very important number in Japanese Buddhism, as it symbolizes purification and renewal, and is a reoccurring theme in Ito's work. In this series called There Can Be Shadows Within a Flash, Ito uses a toy Enola Gay replica airplane, honey, which was used by bomb victims to treat burns, and various oils to create chemograms, which are a kind of photograph. Ito's statement about this work states that he is trying to, quote, acknowledge the complexities of identity within the context of historical traumas, find strength in shared histories while honoring their unique individuality and shedding light on the invisible scars left by radiation. In Ito's I Who Witnessed, we are confronted with a compilation of C-print photographs depicting, again, the number 108 eyes. This collection of 54 American downwinders and 54 Japanese A-bomb victims stares out unblinkingly, homogeneously, and anonymously. Ito again references that number 108 with significance to Japanese Buddhism. To mark the Japanese New Year, bells toll 108 times, ridding us of our evil passions and desires and purifying our souls. Talking about this work, Ito says, growing up in Japan, many thought the bomb victims were necessary sacrifices for peace. After moving to America, I heard the same sentiments about downwinders. Some of the first victims were Americans who worked the first tests unaware of the deadly and invisible threat of radiation. After the war, the US government continued nuclear testing across the nation, and these forgotten American casualties, civilians living around the test sites, are now known as downwinders. As they collectively stare back at us, their eyes become a monument of nameless atomic testimonies. Will we too become a witness of irradiated light and be sacrificed for the so-called next peace? This is the last body of work I'll talk about by Ito, and it was created while he was in the residence at Santa Fe Art Institute. Where the Mountains Glow is a multimedia piece consisting of 4 uranium glass objects: a peacemaker revolver, a Native American head in traditional headwear, an arrowhead, and a butterfly. These objects, relics of the Industrial Revolution, modernization, and colonization, are placed onto 4 images taken from various photographic archives, such as Times Magazine and the Associated Press. Of this work, Ito says, a recent direction in my artistic practice is to bridge the gap in who is seen as nuclear victims. My heritage, as a 3rd-generation atomic bomb victim, is seen as the epitome of nuclear victimhood. However, Americans and Native Americans were often some of the first and continue to be victimized by nuclear programs. Accompanying the objects is a 25-foot-long roll of paper that lists the abandoned uranium mines on Navajo lands. The imagery, objects, and data are all publicly available, but are not often addressed due to various factors. Using his own identity, research, and experience, Where the Mountains Glow shines a UV blacklight onto the invisible, forgotten, and often an ongoing trauma that still inhabits the land and the people. And this is another installation shot. You can see here that 25-foot-long roll of paper that lists the abandoned uranium mines that are present on Navajo lands. And here is a close-up of that uranium glass, which glows green when it's put under a UV blacklight. And I know many of you are watching this as a recording, so here are some of the resources that I used to gather material for this talk. I'm not an expert on nuclear art by any means, but I'm very interested in this as I come at it from an environmental stance. And I want to thank you for joining us. And if you've enjoyed this, please put down May 8th at 6:30 p.m. on your calendars for our next talk, which will be Weather as Muse, art that embraces images and collaborates with the weather. So thank you again for coming.
Thank you. Any questions before I have a question? I guess not, but I have a side question. Are there any other trends in art that is relatively new like this? Like it's dated quite short in the context? Are there any other environmental or things like that? The other issues we were touching on family, they're like long distance in art history, or these are kind of shorter. Any other trends like that you can think of?
Oh, I think there's lots of things like this. I think many environmental artists are, thinking about things like chemical spills, right? For instance, right? And the way that those are changing watersheds. That comes to mind right away. But I do think that there are going to be several of these sort of categories of art where, we think about like the isms, as being ways that we can conveniently talk about art and fit it into sort of a collective box, if you will, impressionism, fauvism, those sorts of things. And I think that there will be many of these as we look back. But with the sort of widespread, with the internet and how knowledge is just spread, around the globe in sort of different ways now, I think that artists have this unique opportunity at this moment to be able to make works about places that they could never have visited right before, right? Using things like Google mapping and satellite images, right? It just gives us access to data that we have never had in the past.
Anybody else? All right, I guess we'll leave it at. I just blown away of some of the art that's relatively poisonous to us as humans. It's like a creative process, and I don't know. I was excited for this one. So thank you
Great.
all for coming, and this will get posted at some point, and we will hopefully see you at our next session. Thank you all.
Thank you.